Part 3, Archetypes and Jung's Vision of the World. According to Jung, the fundamental elements of collective unconsciousness are archetypes. He thought about them as universal unconscious factors responsible for your mind's generation of the primal symbols or images. These symbols, and also some patterns of your behavior, can be derived from this collective level of mind. They are in opposition to instincts, which are of a more biological and material nature. Archetypes prefigure and direct your conscious behavior. They have a noumenal nature, and people are able to perceive only their emerged forms. You can't experience the archetype in itself. Archetypes actualize within a particular personal or collective context. They also influence your development, called in Jungian terms the individuation. Archetypes are built into your personal unconsciousness in a very similar way to your unconscious complexes that affect your thoughts and actions. Jung once formulated the relationship between the archetype and the instinctive mode of behavior in a diagrammatic model I call the spectrum of the psyche matter. In this picture, the infrared end of the spectrum metaphorically represents the matter pole of the human being, its material, biological aspect and content. The ultraviolet end of the spectrum metaphorically expresses the sphere of the psyche, but in a wider sense also the spiritual dimension of man and the world. At the infrared pole, the psychic processes flow or merge into the physical processes. At the archetypal pole, the modes of psychological reactions merge into the archetypal, spiritual domain. At this end of the spectrum, the unobservable archetypal entities impose themselves on the psyche as archetypal images, visions, representations, or thoughts. See further, M. L. von Franz, 2001, Psyche and Matter. M. L. von Franz underlines that archetypes are contaminated with one another and merge one into the other. They are not like separate particles, similarly to electrons, which were formerly viewed as little particles but now are perceived also as waves of potentiality. Von Franz says, the archetypes do not swim around in the collective unconscious like pieces of bread in a soup, but rather they are the whole soup at every point and therefore always appear in specific mixtures. That is also why they are so hard to describe clearly outside of an individual psychological context. Franz, 2001, Psyche and Matter. The archetypes not only underlie those of mankind's religious and mythical conceptions that are similar throughout the world and are not only the basic categories of our day-to-day life fantasies, they also underlie science with its imaginative or even paradigmatic or intellectual premises. We can learn about it, for example, from the book of S. Sambursky, who in his book Die physikalische Weltbild in der Antike, 1965, demonstrated how the basic themes of modern Western physics were derived from the intuitive primal symbolic images of Greek natural philosophy. From there comes the idea of a single prime matter out of which the entire visible cosmos is somehow constituted, as well as the idea of the conservation of this prime matter, in other words, the concept of the universal energy. Franz, 2001, Psyche and Matter. But the archetypes are only a part of Jung's vision of the world. His vision also played a significant role in the other concepts, like the unus mundus, a vision of the world including a spiritual aspect with concepts of a spirit and a human soul, and a concept of God. I won't elaborate on those concepts in this book, but I'd like to underline here the importance of remembering them when you try to think in Jungian terms about the world and about ourselves. From a Jungian point of view, you are not only a materialistic perceived entity. You have a soul, and what is even more striking, your soul is or can be in contact with a spiritual reality closely associated in Jungian theory with the concept of anima mundi. For Jung, the unus mundus is the primordial unified reality from which everything derives, including archetypes, a concept of the psychoidal nature of the world and a phenomenon of synchronicity. Archetypes are here perceived as an expression of the unus mundus and the synchronicity, or the meaningful coincidence that may happen due to the immanent interconnections between all things that exist. Part 4, the archetype of the self. Jung understands the self not only as the unconscious subject but also as the archetypal entity. The self understood as an archetype is particularly paradoxical. It can be said that in its archetypal essence, it's male and female, material and spiritual, etc. It's constantly becoming, leading us to some obscure, final goal, and at the same time, it is somehow a predetermined entity. It is powerful and helpless, it's large and small. It is a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis in all respects. The self is a real complexio oppositorum, a union of the opposites. The self-archetype appears in symbolic forms in dreams, myths, or fairy tales in such forms as a figure of a king, a hero, a prophet, or a savior. It's associated with symbols representing a certain idealized perfection, the whole, for example, a circle, a square, see, quadratura circuli, or a cross, and in the human perspective with images of higher, royal forms of existence. The symbolism of this archetype is associated with the scenery of the coexistence of the opposites, or with the process of their unification. It's expressed through a whole range of various symbolic forms. Below, I present a few examples of such symbols in a diagram developed by Jung, Ion, 1979, to integrate this symbolic imagery. A diagram that integrates the various symbols of the self-archetype. The diagram shows various forms of symbols that are characterized both by the power of combining opposites and by clearly resisting or relating to them. At the extreme poles, on the right and left, we can see here the opposites Christ and Diabolus. These extreme opposites represent the dualism that exists in the world and indicates a tension present in the experiences of all human beings. On the vertical axis, we see a gradation of various forms and symbols stretched between the superhuman anthropos, expressing the higher, spiritual human form, and the rotundum, that is, the round form, being an abstract, inanimate symbol, yet bearing the hallmarks of wholeness and perfection. Among the above-mentioned borderline forms, Jung places the legendary lapis, i.e., the philosopher's stone, serpens, i.e., the serpent, and finally the man. Let us add that within this generally outlined scenery, at every level of it, we will discover and be able to further differentiate the existing archetypal symbolic formation. It can be said that the next levels of the symbolic expression of the archetype are subject to further differentiation as they are discovered. To make this image clearer, I present below a couple of examples of the symbols we can associate with this archetype. Here you can see an example of a symbol of rotundum and etheriomorphic, having an animal form, symbolism. This is another example of a symbol of rotundum, also the archetypal symbol of a tree, a symbol of a rainbow. This is the example of an anthropomorphic and theriomorphic symbol, is a symbol of rotundum, including also a motif of a rainbow and, to some extent, a symbol of integrating elements of the ideal man anthropos. This is another example of the symbol of rotundum.